So learning how to play, you can't separate it from learning how to practice. And practicing is really learning how to learn or learning how to teach yourself, especially if you're getting a lot of information here online or from a video or a book that you've got, as opposed to sitting down with someone and actually studying with them one-on-one. So here are 5 things that I always find myself talking to people about when they have questions about how to practice. Because a lot of times at the end of a workshop or at the end of an online course or something, or even like if someone has a book, I'll get an email, like, well, I'm working on the book, like, how do I practice this? How do I work on this? And I always find myself saying a lot of the same things. So here are 5 of the things that I hear coming out of my mouth on a regular basis about this. The first one is to keep it finite, right? Like, you can't practice everything and you can't get good at everything all at the same time. It's just physically impossible. Like, nobody has the time to work on everything. And if you're like me, you probably have like a huge list of things. You're like, man, I'd love to get good at that. I'd love to get good at that. Like, I want to work on this thing. But pick one of those or pick a couple. Because I bet that even within the one thing you want to get good at, there's different parts to it. And that's something we're going to get to in just a second. But on a global level, get it down to the one thing that you want to work on right now. Maybe the thing that seems the most important to you right now, or the thing that's been bugging you for the longest that you can't quite do. But pick that thing, and it could be, I don't know, improvising. It could be knowing your scales. It could be being able to get around more on the guitar with more chord voicings. It could be being able to play the songs that you like without stumbling. It could be something you've got some new tab for. It could be anything. But you want to be finite and say, like, this is the thing that I'm working on. And that being finite has another application too, which is be finite about your practice time. A lot of times this just is kind of done for you by your schedule and what time you have available. But in my mind, I always try to look at practicing as something I can get done in 30 minutes or less on a given day. And that way you don't, it's like exercising. Like, if you knew you were going to go run for 3 hours every day, if that was like what you set yourself up to do, you'd be like, I don't have 3 hours, I don't have 3 minutes, I'm busy. But if it's 30 minutes or less, and it's like, well, I could waste the next 30 minutes reading this news story or watching this sitcom, or 30 minutes, it'll be over before you know it. And that's actually good psychologically, to me anyway, to know that what I'm about to set out to do doesn't have that much going on. It's not going to take that long. And that's, if you make it so there's only so much time to practice, then that also will affect your longer range picture of, like, well, what am I trying to learn next? Because it has to be something you can work on kind of incrementally. And that's good because it makes you focus down and get very specific. The next thing is to zero in on the hard part of what you're working on. So I have this harebrained thing I'm doing right now where I never really learned how to play the piano. And since part of my job is writing music, it kind of sucks to be terrible at the piano. So I thought, well, I'll start by learning scales, right? And it's hard. But I got to where I could sort of play them, I could play the major scales in all the keys, kind of, right hand, left hand. I started off thinking, like, I'm going to learn to play them in octaves, because, like, that's what I saw my friends do in college. Like, I was like, turns out that's actually absurdly hard. So then I got down to just one hand, and then right hand and left hand. But I got to where I kind of could do it. But then I realized, like, oh, the part that I can't do yet, I can get up the scale. I can get up the scale with my right hand, but I can't get back down very smoothly. And the left hand's even worse. So I zeroed it down. I was like, okay, I'm going to take just 5, 6 keys, just the flat keys, because those are the hardest. And I'm going to do them just with my left hand, and I'm just going to do them going down, because going down is harder than going up. So I isolated it down to, like, just these 6 descending scales. And that's what I practiced. And the first week it was horrible. And the next week it got a little better. And then, like, the third or fourth week I was like, oh, cool, it's getting there. So I isolated it down to that one thing by starting with the hardest part. And then going back and doing the easy keys, they're not so bad. And, on guitar, it's also very similar. Like, if you're trying to learn the fingerboard, and you start learning to kind of, like, identify the notes, well, the easy ones are on the low string and the high string, and the easy ones are in the open position. But you get up around the 8th or 9th fret on the middle two strings, and suddenly it's like, what in, it's all completely impossible. So if you were like, I really want to know the names of the notes on the fingerboard, then I would say start with the 4th and 3rd strings between the 7th and 12th frets and learn those, right? That's the hardest part on the guitar. And it's really finite. And if you can learn those 5 frets on those 2 strings, the rest will seem much easier. So you want to zero in on the tricky thing. Same thing like if you're working on fingerstyle, like the hard part's the coordination, right? It's like you can learn, playing through the piece, making mistakes, but playing through it, that's easy. You can play your mistakes, great, but go to the part that you're messing up. Go to the mistakes and isolate them and be like, okay, this mistake, I'm going to get to where like this mistake, this part that's a mistake now, that's going to be the part I know the best. And you zero in, and it's just a couple measures, right? So you just go to the hard part, you work on that first, and then the other parts will seem easier. So finite, and then zeroing in on what's hard. Now, the third thing is to divide up what you've got that you're working on into the different pieces, because for everything you're working on, there's usually kind of a mental part to it, whether that's remembering things or associating, like if you're working on learning the fingerboard, then it's just remembering, like the sheer memory of it. But there's also, if you're improvising, it's remembering what notes go in what chord or what scale goes with what chord progression. Or if it's learning like new chord voicings, it's just remembering where they go, like, what fret is the D chord at with that string? What fret is a G? So that part of it, just sort of, there's the mental part of just knowing like, where does this go on the guitar? But then there's the physical component, like the actual agility of getting there on time. Those are 2 different things, and you can divide those out. So knowing where to go and then being able to physically get there on time, you can break those apart and work on them separately, so that if you're trying to do both at once, you're asking too much of your brain. It's trying to process too much. If you split those into 2 different jobs, you can work on one, you can work on the other. Eventually, you can put them together. And so there's those 2 pieces. And the third thing to any kind of task is sort of the performance or the repertoire part of it, right? Because you're learning these skills, both the mental part and the physical part, and then you're attaching those skills to specific tunes or specific repertoire. So, if there's like a remembering where your thumb goes on a fingerstyle groove, and there's the agility and the strength to get there and to get the notes clean, that's the mental and the physical part, then, it's applying it to, the 1, 4, and 5 chord of a particular song. That's the repertoire piece. Or, it's just if you're zeroing in on that one piece that's a mistake in a piece you already know, then it's putting it in context, knowing how to play the whole piece. So there's a repertoire component too. So if you can divide out what you're working on into these 3 pieces, that can be super helpful. The last 2 pieces kind of go together. Excuse me. And one of them is to write things down. And the other is to treat your own learning like you were the teacher. So basically have a lesson with yourself. So let's call it number 4, like having a lesson. And that is, to like have a notebook or like a book or whatever, if you're working out of a book that you're learning out of or a video or whatever, have a place that you write down. Like, I'm talking literally like the date and like, this week I'm doing this. Like, these are the things I'm working on. I'm going to work on, learning this scale. I'm working on this piece and I'm applying it to this, I'm improvising on this kind of chord progression, whatever it is. Maybe probably no more than 3 things, right? Because we've kind of talked about dividing out what you're working on into these 3 components of mental and physical and repertoire. So, but just writing it down, and then maybe, I didn't even mention working with the metronome, which is another huge part of practicing, but we'll leave that for some other time. But assuming you're doing that, then metronome markings or what backing track you're practicing over, or if you're like learning something off of a record and what that record is, what measures you're working on, or what minute in the CD, or whatever it is you're doing. So just like writing it out, and then, that's the most important part. And then so the next week you can kind of check in on the same day and be like, well, how's it going? Do I need to bump up the metronome? Do I need to move on a couple measures? That sort of thing. So that the paper is kind of your accountability. And that way you miss a few days and you're like, oh, well, but by next Monday, like I got to check in. And so it's kind of an incentive to like show up and do your little half hour, you know, because you know that Monday's coming around again, and you're not going to slide it to Thursday or Friday if you decide in your head like Monday is the day that you give yourself a lesson. And you don't have to do that. I mean, if any of these things that make it feel like less fun, you don't want to do. But if getting good feels fun, then this might help. Just depends. Again, these are like things that work for me, and so they might work for you. They might not. But so doing the lesson part of it, and then writing it down in the sense of like writing it down as a lesson, but also like tracking. I guess the fifth thing. Like I said, it's tied to the fourth thing, but also writing down the results as you go, making notes, keeping track of like, this part's hard, so that when you come back the next day, you're like, oh yeah, that thing happened. Or just to write down like, yeah, I did that. Again, it's just, you have a place to check in with yourself. So those are some ideas. And everybody, it's a very personal thing. Different things work for different people. This is kind of just what has worked for me in a lot of situations. But if you've got things that work for you, scroll down, drop me a line, say something about it. I'd love to hear what you're thinking about, how you practice, what you're working on, and what works for you. If you feel like I overlooked something, or you got a question or a comment, I'd love to hear from you. So there it is, 5 tips for practicing. I'll see you next time.